In this video, we're going to look at some of our small 2-liter engines here and talk about how to remove and reinstall a timing belt and some of the important steps along that process. This is a 2-liter GM-based engine. It was sold under a marquee of Holden over in Australia. We acquired these through a supplier called PSI in Chicago. They were destined to be forklift engines. We utilized them here at Parkland in our first year curriculum to do engine disassembly and reassembly. And the thing that we want to focus on today is how to remove and reinstall a timing belt. Timing belts are commonplace on a lot of cars. They've pretty much become overrun by timing chains, but a lot of the process in setting up a timing belt is the same on a chain and is arguably easier to work with. So it's a good first step to understanding the relationship between cam and crankshaft and how to go about making sure that you set that properly to ensure proper timing and ensure that we don't create any damage to valves or other components within the engine. We're going to start this process by taking the front cover off. Once we got the cover off, we can see the timing belt. This cogged belt right here is my timing belt. It engages with the cam gear that drives my camshaft, and it is driven by the crankshaft, and there's a gear for that as well. Here in the middle then I've got some secondary components. On this vehicle it's driving the water pump, and then it also has an idler and tensioner right here. And so the goal of this belt is to keep the crank and camshaft correlation together so that the valve events are properly timed with the cylinders. It's important to recognize that that relationship is critical and that on a lot of engine applications, they are interference, which means that if the timing between the cam and the crank becomes disrupted beyond a certain point, a piston when traveling upward will contact one of the valves and damage it. When this happens, it creates a substantial amount of damage and a substantial amount of cost to repair. Most service information portals like AllData have their own specific technician reference for looking at which engine applications are freewheeling and non-interference versus the ones that are interference. It's important to recognize that that is something that could be possible, and as a technician we need to just be cautious and ensure that we're always paying attention to whether or not I'm turning both of these in sync. Before I remove this timing belt, I always want to time the engine and put it on top dead center for the compression event on cylinder number 1. We see this expressed as TDC for 1 in service information, and we're going to achieve that by rotating the crank and looking for some alignment marks. All timing belt and timing chain systems have some sort of alignment marks. I'm going to have to go to service information to learn those, and I want to apply that to my application. On this specific one, the timing marks are this small white dot that's on my crank pulley. It aligns with a small indentation in the oil pump housing. And then on my cam gear up top, I've got another notch that's been painted white, and it correlates with this notch in the plastic cover behind the cam gear. So I'm going to rotate this until I get those lined up. You'll notice right now that this one is lined up at the crank, but the cam gear is 180 degrees off. That tells me that I'm at top dead center on cylinder 1, but it's for the exhaust stroke. Remember that the cam gear only rotates 360 degrees for all the events on this engine, whereas the crankshaft is going to rotate 720 degrees, which is 2 full rotations, and that's why this is going to line up twice, even though I don't have this lined up yet. One of the things I want to pay attention to when I rotate it is the rotation direction. On this, I can look at it and I can establish which way it's going to rotate based on some elements. The slack side of the timing belt is the one where the tensioner lives. That's always going to be on the trailing side of whatever the rotation is. And so this crank pulley is always going to rotate clockwise on this engine, making this a direct path to pulling the cam gear, with the slack occurring on this side as it comes off the crank pulley. So I always want to make sure I rotate that, and I want to avoid rotating it backwards. And so if I miss my timing marks, I should rotate further forward and continue in the same direction until I get to the marks where I want to be. We've got now this pulley almost lined up, and this one up here is lined up. This is an engine that has been apart before, and so there's a chance that it did not get reassembled properly. One of the things that becomes difficult, we'll talk about as we reinstall the belt, is that getting all of the slack out of the driven side is a key to making sure I keep my timing marks after the slack is absorbed on my tensioner. Before we take that belt off, I do want to point out where and how this tensioner is set so that we can repeat that when we go back together. This specific tensioner uses spring pressure, and it's got a pointer right here, and then it's got a window for where we should align that pointer. The smallest divot where it is lined up now is the initial setting, and then the window to the left of that is the working range of the tensioner and a way that we can monitor whether or not the belt has stretched. I've got my tensioner loose now, and we're about ready to remove the belt. Another note that we want to point out is on some applications, the manufacturer is going to have me lock this camshaft in place somehow, especially with dual cam models and certain V-bank engines, so that the camshafts don't move. Sometimes the resting position for TDC1 might have a valve event where a valve spring is in tension, and that could kick the cam and make the can move. We don't want cams to snap and move like that, because we could create a conflict of interference. This engine does not need the camshaft locked, and so we're going to go ahead and begin to remove the belt. So with my belt off like this, if I'm going to reuse this, I want to make sure I know which way it's rotating. I also want to do a quick inspection on it. So I know now that the letters here, which way they orient, that's going to help me decide which way to put it back together. When I inspect a belt like this, I can pinch it mildly and look for cracks and weathering. As this rubber component of the belt dries out, it becomes brittle and cracks begin to develop. That's one thing that I can look at. I do not want to pinch this completely because I can damage the belt by doing that. This belt is in good shape, and so we're going to reuse it. Make sure you check the manufacturer's mileage and service life intervals for timing belts to ensure it's getting replaced at the proper interval. This particular engine was a little bit out of time, and so I'm going to go ahead and rotate the crankshaft and put this mark back in alignment before we reinstall the belt. When I go to reinstall the belt, oftentimes there will be a specific sequence that I need to follow, and if there is one by the manufacturer, I want to make sure I follow that. Otherwise, I always want to establish the non-slack or the driven side first and then work into the slack side. This is the one that establishes my timing, meaning if I get this one too loose, one of these pulleys is going to rotate out of alignment before it becomes tight, and I'm going to lose my mark. That's likely what happened and why this engine was out of time to begin with. So on this engine, it's going to be easiest for me to start at the crank pulley because of where this belt sits within, and then run that up and set it on the cam pulley, then work to the slack side here. And so I want to make sure that I've got a good alignment and a good amount of tension here. It may take a little bit of finessing of these two pulleys to establish that. So if you're meeting halfway between the cogged marks here, you can go ahead and make small adjustments within the timing marks to get this at the best tension possible. It's important to get this established with some good tension so that the cam and crank stay within alignment. So with my crank and my cam set, I've got to now deal with the tensioner assembly and the water pump down here. One of the struggles on this particular engine is that the water pump has a lip on the edge of the pulley. And so that's something that I'm going to have to contend with. When I go to do that one, I'm going to want to do that one first and leave this tensioner pulley, which is smooth, for last. And I've really got to maintain some tension on the rest of the pulleys as I do this so that the timing does not jump off one of the other pulleys in the process. Once I get this water pump on, now I can work on this tensioner last. Once I get that one set, now I'm in good shape. After I get these set, I want to make sure that my driven side over here has got a good amount of tension. I don't want it to be too loose. With the belt set, now I can set the tension of the belt and lock down the tensioner. So on this particular tensioner, I'm going to use the hex key right here in order to set the pointer that we looked at previously in the proper spot. So I'm going to rotate that up, get it set. It's important that I come back and torque that pinch bolt to the proper value. Now that I got my belt back on, the tensioner is set, it's torqued down, now I can go about verifying my timing. This is a very important last step to doing timing and timing belt work. I want to make sure that all of my timing marks are lined up. Right now it looks like my crankshaft is lined up on that oil pump housing. My notch and my timing cover is lined up with my notch on my cam gear. We look to be in good shape. But my next step is to rotate the engine 720 degrees. I want to go 2 full rotations at the crank and verify that I come back to my marks properly. This helps me ensure that I was able to get this set properly without extra slack, and ensures I don't have issues. If I had something else that was loose or a problem, hopefully I find it rotating by hand rather than waiting to try and start the engine. So I rotated 2 full turns. We've come back to our position. I've got good alignment at my crank, and I've got good alignment up here at my camshaft. Again, doing that rotation by hand is critical to make sure that I truly have it set properly. Without going through that step, I risk being out of alignment because of additional slack on the driven side, or maybe I've left something loose. Hopefully that will show as I go through that process. That's the process of removing and replacing a timing belt. It's important to pay attention to the sequences, pay attention to the service information, and make sure we do this job properly. We always want to double and triple check things in this realm because we know that an incorrect installation on an interference engine could result in thousands of dollars worth of damage.